baptized Christian. There are many things that Jesus commanded us to do, many moral teachings, many ways of living and living amongst with each other, but there's actually only one mission that he gave to us as his children, as his church, and that is this right here. So let's read it quickly together. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. So, for those of you who are good at grammar, for the sake of time, I actually already highlighted it, but what are the four verbs in this commission, in this passage? Go, baptize, teaching, okay. Somebody might have said it, but I didn't hear it. Make disciples, okay. Now, actually, three of these verbs are not imperatives. They're not commands. They are participles. They support the one command. This word go here at the top is actually better translated going. So in Tagalog, they translate it in your going or as you're going. As you're going, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them, teaching them to obey. Only one of those is actually a command, and that is to make disciples. The other three are steps that we go through in making those disciples. The Jewish nation thought that they should wait for the lost to come to them. And very clearly, Jesus teaches the church that he's organizing to do his mission that no, you're not to wait anymore, you're to go. Go to them. Go to the lost. And then as you make disciples, one of the steps is baptizing, yes. We're really good at that in the Adventist church, though, so I'm not going to spend much time talking about baptism. But I want to look a little bit more here at teaching them. Is that really all it says? Does it just say teach? Teaching them to obey. So often we equate conversion with just conveying information. Just need to get the 28 fundamental beliefs across and get people to check, yes, I believe these. And that is equated with conversion. But Jesus doesn't say just teach them. He says teach them to obey, which is a process. It takes time. It takes growth and development. And by the way, I want to point one more thing out here. What is it that Jesus is teaching us to, or what we're supposed to teach them to obey? Everything he commanded. So yes, the 10 Commandments, yes, these other things. But what is it that he just commanded us to do? To make disciples. So we're supposed to go out, we're supposed to make disciples, then we're supposed to teach those disciples to obey everything he commanded, including to make disciples. And so then automatically they're supposed to do the same thing. Even in the Great Commission, we have multiplication built into it. Multiplication. Now let's go on to the actual imperative, make disciples. What does this mean? And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. What does it mean to make disciples? Discipleship, discipling, is an old word. It's not really a word that we commonly use anymore, except in the Christian context. In Jesus' time, it was part of their educational system. It was partly based on the Greek, with a little bit of a twist from the school of the prophets kind of a thing. And Jesus modified it a little bit more, what discipleship looks like. But there's a really good illustration. Would somebody be willing to volunteer, come up and help me just for a moment? Judy, would you like to come up, help me? Okay. So in the Jewish way of discipleship, they say that a good disciple, the front of his clothes are always white. Okay, so you're going to be the rabbi. Come closer. You're going to be the rabbi. I'm going to be your disciple. Okay, and just slowly walk that direction. So as my rabbi is walking along the roads and teaching, I am sticking as close as I possibly can because I want to hear every word that comes out of my rabbi's mouth. Okay, thank you. I want to hear everything she says, everything she's teaching. I want to not just obey what she teaches me to do, but I want to like imbibe her spirit, to become like her. That's why on the roads of Palestine, which were dirt roads and everybody's wearing flip-flops, when I'm walking that closely behind the rabbi, of course the front of my clothes get all covered in white dust. That's why a good disciple, the best disciple, his clothes are all white on the front. Okay? So a disciple wants to become like his master, like his rabbi, like his teacher, wants to do everything that they do. One of the church leaders that I really have a tremendous amount of respect for, his name is G.T. Ng, and until recently he was the executive secretary of the General Conference. I had the privilege of being in one of his classes, And he asked us, this is in Southeast Asia, so everybody has coconuts there. He asked us, what is the purpose of a coconut tree? Okay, so bear fruit. Some of us said for coconut milk, to make curry with, and coconut water. Some people said to make lumber. It's not very good lumber, but it'll do the job. Thatching, it's also not very good thatching, but it can also be a temporary thatch. And he said, yes, those are all good uses of the coconut tree, but my question is, what is the purpose of a coconut tree? If you ask the coconut tree, what did you say, Wendy? Yeah, well, to produce fruit, which the fruit is supposed to make more coconut trees. If you ask a coconut tree what its purpose is, the coconut tree purpose is to make more coconut trees. And there's another Jewish proverb about discipleship that says that let's see, how does it go? A rabbi's job is not finished until his disciples are rabbis as well. They have their own disciples. So again, we see the multiplication built into this. And we're going to get more into this a little bit later. But at the risk of getting in trouble here, I want to talk a little bit about the way that we currently tend to want to finish God's work. So we know from Matthew 24:14 that before Jesus comes back again, that every person in the world has to have heard the gospel. As Adventists, we're waiting for the end-time prophecies to be fulfilled, but it's very clear before those will happen, one more thing needs to happen, and that is for the gospel to go to the entire world. And as Adventists, we tend to think that this is the way that this is going to happen, through mass evangelism. Now, before I go any further, I want to say mass evangelism is not wrong. Okay? So I'm going to critique it a little bit, but I want to be clear, mass evangelism is not bad. Okay? But a lot of times we say that Jesus spent a lot of time preaching to the crowds. But if you actually look at how much time he spent preaching to the crowds, it was a relatively small portion of his ministry. Jesus spent 30,000 hours in ministry. Only a few of those were spent preaching. So we did the math at Adventist Frontier Missions, and say this is from the last GC session before COVID. There were 70,000 people in this stadium. So let's just say that we get a little bit bigger stadium, fill it with 100,000 people, and we do something exceptional, and we get all of our preaching into one day, and the best basically ratio that we can expect from a mass evangelistic series in a really good, really receptive place is about 20% of those people will accept and be baptized. So say we have 100,000 people, and 20,000 of those agree to be baptized. And then the next day, we do the same thing again. We fill the whole stadium with 100,000 people and baptize 20,000 of them. Every single day we do this. How long do you think it would take to reach the world? Anyone want to hazard a guess? A week? No. Not a year either. Not 50 years. If the population stopped growing today, which of course that won't happen, but if it just stopped growing today, it would take 1,000 years to reach the world. Unfortunately, because we have relied on this too much, and again, it's not saying it's wrong, it's bad to do, but we've relied on this too much, the statistics are actually that the total population of the unreached in the world are growing every year. As many thousands that are reported being baptized every year, the unreached, the people who don't know Christ and have no way of knowing about Christ, are growing faster than we are. We're actually losing ground. But it's interesting that the way that Jesus taught us to reach the world wasn't by relying only on this. And so we ran the numbers again at AFM. And we said, okay, discipleship, which, by the way, a modern word, I forgot to say this earlier, a modern word for discipleship is training. So if you have a hard time getting your mind, what does discipleship mean? It's an old word. Basically, it means training. So a disciple is a trainee, and discipleship is training in this specific type of work. So we take one Christian, and this Christian spends 1 year, one entire year, just working with one person. He goes and lives with that person, works with the person, hangs out with the person, helps the person. I'm not talking about just like giving handouts, but practically helping them, just like Jesus did. We know the famous quote, Christ's method alone. And the entire year, he spends discipling this one person. Then the next year, the two of them, each of them go and find one more person. And they spend the whole of next year just discipling one person each. Okay? We have an axiom in missiology. We say, go slow to go fast. Seems like a very slow approach to evangelism when compared with 100,000 people in the stadium every day, right? How long do you think it would take to reach the world in this paradigm? A little bit more. 34 years. 34 years. Except, of course, we know that many people will be able to disciple more than just one person. In the Bible, we find people discipling more than just one person. So I do believe that it could go much, much faster. But this is the power of discipleship and multiplying discipleship that Jesus taught us to do in the Bible. So that's a little bit of an overview of discipleship. Now's the part that you've been waiting for. So here are the mission stories about how this practically has been done, how it's been done specifically in the Philippines. So I'm a little bit nervous here because my first story actually isn't my story, it's my mom's story. And so I'm sure I'll hear after the sermon about the details that I got wrong here. But when we first went to the Philippines, about 1 or 2 years after we arrived there, we were working there, and the people they had really bad experiences with many different outsiders. The Spanish occupied the Philippines, other Filipinos moved into our island, the Japanese occupation, etc. So they really had a deep distrust of anyone from the outside world. So when this story happened, they actually hadn't opened up to us and told us what they believed. We could observe their culture from the outside, but we didn't know, especially their interactions with the spirit world, with the demons that harassed them constantly. And so one night, my mom and dad were laying in bed. Well, all three of us were laying in bed. I was up in my room in the bamboo portion of the house. And my mom woke up with a man standing over her saying, ma'am, wake up, wake up. Well, of course, that's a little bit startling. In America, we don't usually have people walking into our bedrooms, but in their culture, it's very common to do. And we didn't have glass in the windows, just an open hole in the wall. So when he was calling mom from the outside and she didn't hear, he just walked through the window and came right into the bedroom. And so he saw, though, that she was startled, kind of jumped back and said, sorry, but Pansuray is really, really sick. Can you please come help Pansuray? Well, Mom has this extraordinary ability to sleep. She loves sleeping. And it's once she gets started, it's really hard to get her to stop. And I've had actually relatively long, complicated conversations with her. Only come to find out that she actually was still asleep. So she was at least partly awake at this point, and she got up and got dressed and got her go bag that she always had ready. I don't know if you had it in the clinic or in the house. At the house, okay. And she started across the village to Pansuray's house, but she was still, I think, probably mostly asleep at this point. And as she makes her way closer to Pansuray's house, she notices that they've built these fires all around the house. Now, when I say house, I mean like a bamboo and grass hut. And she notices that there are young men that are running from fire to fire, and they're yelling, "Penguros, penguros, 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 penguros." And she thinks, what was that all about? What's going on there? But again, they hadn't yet opened up to us. And so she climbed up into the house, and as you climb up into these houses, especially when there's any kind of an emergency, it's like your head hits a ceiling of smoke. Like the house is just full of smoke. And everybody is crammed into the house. They do everything together, especially if there's an emergency. Everybody's giving advice, everybody's critiquing everybody else and encouraging. And yeah, it's a big, fun, happy mess. And so Mom made her way across the bamboo floor. Back then, they didn't really have nails so much, so they just tied round bamboo onto the floor joists with vines. And so they kind of rolled around. It's kind of challenging to get across the floor. She went over into the corner where Pansuray was laying, and this actually isn't Pansuray, but it's the best picture I have of what it probably looked like that night. And as she's making her way across the house, the hut, she notices that there are some old men with machetes. And they're sticking their machetes through the floor, and there are young men near the walls, which aren't really walls, it's just grass that comes down to almost the floor, and they're poking sharpened bamboo through the walls, through the grass. And all of them are also yelling, "Penguros, penguros, 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 penguros." And she makes her way over to Pansuray, and she asks, "Pansuray, what's wrong? What's going on? And Pansuray said, oh, ma'am, while I was out in the jungle today, I bumped into a bukao, which is one of the spirits, one of the demons that harass them. And they most of the time, they're invisible. But if you bump into them, they get really, really angry. And so she said, I bumped into this bukao accidentally, and he got really angry at me, and he speared me in my stomach. And we know that if this can't be treated, I will be dead within 24 hours. Well, Mom wasn't quite so sure about that, but Pansuray also went on to explain, did you see the young men that are running from fire to fire, and the old men that are poking the bamboo through the walls and yelling, Pangurus, Pangurus, Pangurus? They're trying to drive the spirits away. And when you came in, did you see my brother-in-law, Tanoy? He had ginger burning in a coconut shell, and he was blowing the smoke over me. They're trying to drive the spirit away, but nothing has worked, and so that's why we called you. So again, Mom wasn't too sure about all the spirit stuff, but she checked Pansuray out from head to toe, best she could, and couldn't find anything physically wrong with her. But Pansuray said her stomach hurt, so she said, okay, well, maybe I'll try some charcoal. So she mixed up a big coconut shell full of charcoal and said, Pansuray, I know it's going to be hard, but you need to drink all of this down before you go to sleep tonight. Pansuray said, okay. So she sat up and glug, 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 drank the whole thing straight down. And Mom's scratching her head even more. What is really going on here? And she said, Pansuray, I'm not sure if this really is a spirit or if this is something physical that am not able to assess here. But either way, God can help you. Is it okay? Would it be okay if I prayed for you? And Pansuray said, well, yes, that's why I called you over here. That's what I wanted you to come do. And she kind of looked over at Tanoy to see, because Tanoy, her brother-in-law, was the shaman and didn't like us at all. But he had tried everything he could do and wasn't able to heal her. And so Mom knelt down, put her hands on Pansuray, and prayed for her. And then she got up and went home. And the next morning, my mom woke up at noon. Well, because the way that they say it in their language, if you wake up late, it's waking up at noon. So she probably woke up around 6 a.m., but for them, it was already noon. So Mom woke up at noon, and when she woke up, she remembered Pansuray, so she got dressed real quick and ran across the village. And when she got to the house, no one was there. It was completely empty. And she was really sad because in the Mangyan Ugali, Mangyan culture, if someone dies in the night before the sun comes up, they're already buried. And so she thought Pansuray must have died last night. And so she went to some of the neighbors' houses and asked, what happened last night? How's Pansuray? What happened? And they said, oh, ma'am, don't you know? By the time you got back to your house last night, which is like a 2-minute walk maybe across the village, by the time you got back to your house, Pansuray was completely well and is sound asleep. This morning when she woke up, she was feeling so good, she already took off and went up to her mountain farm. You woke up so late, you didn't catch her. God had healed Pansuray in response to Mom's prayer. But the story doesn't end there, because like in Sabbath school, we had a little bit of a discussion about miracles. Pansuray still didn't come to church. Mom continued visiting with her, continued being friends with her. She would do rounds every day, and oftentimes they would meet. And I don't know all of what you did with Pansuray, but I do know that you talked with her. And a little bit later, a few months later, Pansuray got really sick again, this time not with a spirit. She had giardia, but she waited a little bit too long before asking Mom for help. And it was a close call. And Mom started thinking, this might be my last chance. It might have been my last chance to ask Pansuray to accept Christ. But Pansuray, she said, so my mom went to Pansuray and she said, Pansuray, don't you know that God healed you? Well, yes, I know that God healed me. And don't you want to follow God? Yes, I want to follow God. Well, the problem was that she was shy to walk all the way across the village in front of everybody, all the people who didn't like Christians at that point, all the way to the church. And so Mom said, it was Friday that day, Mom said, well, what if I came the next, tomorrow morning and walk with you across the village? Would you like to go to church with me? And Pansuray said, yes, I'd love to do that. And the next morning, my mom woke up, went over there, and for the first time in years, maybe 10, 15, 20 years probably, Pansuray had taken a bath, washed her clothes, combed her hair, had her hair up in a bun, had swept the house out. Mom didn't ask her to do any of these things, but she felt that if she was going to meet God, she needed to be clean. And walked with Mom across the village to the church and started going to church. And at the next opportunity, she was baptized. This is also not Pansuray, but it's the same place where Pansuray was baptized. And until she died, just earlier this year, as far as I know, every single Sabbath, Pansuray faithfully attended the church and told everyone that she knew about the Jesus that had saved her.
And she was a prayer warrior.
She was a prayer warrior, absolutely. Amen. So, not only Pansoray, though, was baptized. This is just one of many, many stories. Many other people were baptized at that time, around that time, and a church was established, and my parents, especially my dad, started training the Hmong themselves to lead their church and to continue on the mission work there. So I want to ask you, this is actually our scripture reading. Sorry, it's in the middle of the sermon. But I want to ask you, was our work done at that point? Was our work as missionaries done at that point? No. Okay. So Paul wrote a lot of books, but most of them are what we call pastoral letters. These are letters to people who are already Christians dealing with problems in a Christian group, in a Christian community. But we have a rare opportunity in Timothy to see some of his kind of reminders of the training that Paul taught his trainee, his disciple, his trainee. And one of them in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, he says, "And the things that you have heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men." Faithful to what? Faithful keeping the 10 Commandments, the 28 fundamental beliefs. These are all good things, but what is his focus here? Faithful men who will also be able to teach others. We'll be able to teach others also. Our work is not done just when we've led someone to Christ. Remember, Jesus spent 30,000 hours training those. Even in Christ's own ministry, we see that Jesus started with just one person. Then he trained 12 disciples. And in Luke chapter 9, we see he sent them out 2 by 2 to go practice doing everything they had seen him do. And the next chapter, we see them come back, and now there's 72. Where did those 72 come from? Well, if you do the math, they went out 2 by 2, 6 teams, and each of them found another 12 disciples. That makes 72 disciples. So now we have 3 generations. And then in Acts 1:15, we see that there are 120. And then a couple chapters later, there are 3,000. Again, we see this discipleship leading to multiplication, multiple generations of disciples. And actually in missiology, some people used to say we're just reading into the text. But you find 4 generations just in this text. You also see 4 generations of disciples that Jesus left before he went back to heaven again. And we have found the same thing in mission work, in cross-cultural mission work. That if we just plant one church, it eventually dies out. If we just train that church to plant second-generation churches, they'll keep on going, but only until they've saturated the surrounding area. If you want the work to continue to grow, to turn into a movement, what we call a disciple-making movement, we need to continue working until there are at least 4 generations. So no, our work wasn't done. And sorry, this may be a little bit long-winded, but it's my one opportunity this year to talk at y'all. So our work was not yet done. The next story happened a few years later when a young man from deeper into the mountains, an area called Sibakui. I don't know if you remember Sibakui area. This young man decided he wanted some money. And of course, there's no money up in the mountains, so he came down to the lowlands and got a job working for some Filipinos in the lowlands, but he didn't want to live with them. Again, there's been a lot of cultural tension over the years, and so he lived in one of our villages and stayed with a family who happened to be an Adventist. And he got a contract to work in the lowlands for a while, but the first morning when he got up to go to work, the family said, wait, you can't go yet. And he said, why? And they sat down, they sang a couple of songs, opened their Bibles, read from the Bible, talked about what they should do, how they should apply what they've read in the Bible, very similar to the way that we study the Bible here. And then they prayed and said, okay, now you can go to work. And the young man thought, that's kind of funny, but it's kind of nice too. And then a few days later, he was getting ready to go to church, getting ready to go to work, and the family said, wait, you can't go to work at all today. Anyone who stays with us needs to follow our rules, and we follow God, who asks us to spend one whole day a week worshiping him. And so he went with the family to church, and he thought after church, well, that's kind of funny, but it's kind of nice too. And he kept on going to worships and going to church until he fell in love with God too. And before he went back up into the mountains, he was baptized. He didn't really know how to read, but the family sat down with him, taught him the alphabet, and he was able to kind of sound out syllables, one syllable at a time. And they gave him a Bible, and when his work was done, he went back up into the mountains again. And when he got up into the mountains, he set his bag down. He climbed up into his father's hut, and he set his bag down, And as they do, the parents ripped open his bag and pulled all of his stuff out because they knew that he had brought pasalubong, gifts when you come back from a journey. And of course, he had some canned fish, and he had some salt, and some fishing line and fishing hooks, things like that for them. And the next day he got up, and his dad was ready to go to work in the mountain farm, but he said, wait a minute, we need to do something first. And so he sat down and he sang a song, and he read a passage from the Bible, and he prayed, and then he said, okay, now we can go to work. And his parents thought, that's kind of weird. They didn't say anything about it until the next Sabbath came. And their son said, Dad, I'm really sorry, but I can't go to work for you today. And at that point, his dad got really, really angry. And he said, this foreign God that you've accepted, he's teaching you to disrespect your parents, he's making you lazy, on and on and on and on. But the young man stood firm. He was not going to go to work that day. And so the parents got all the rest of the village, the way they do there, everybody does everything together, got the whole rest of the village all together, and they started persecuting that young man. But Sabbath after Sabbath after Sabbath, he continued being faithful to what he learned from the Bible. Until one day, the young man got really, really sick. He got so sick, in fact, that he went into a coma. And his parents, they were persecuting him. It was honest. They honestly thought that he had gone astray. They really did love him. They wanted the best for him. And the best thing they knew to do for someone who was sick was take him to a shaman. And so they loaded their son into a hammock, tied it to a pole, and captured one of their young pigs and started walking to a nearby. The shaman was so powerful, they didn't want him living in the village. It's kind of dangerous. Sometimes the spirits, kick back. And so they walked to the shaman's house out in the jungle. And when they got there, this is the most powerful shaman in the whole region. When they got there, they gave the shaman the pig, because shamans never do anything for free. And they said, please, will you heal my son? And so the shaman sat down in the hammock, and he put the sheet made out of flour sacks over his head. He started rocking back and forth in the hammock and calling the spirits. And the parents waited and watched, and they noticed that the shaman was rocking and rocking and chanting and chanting and chanting and chanting, and seemed to be taking forever. It takes like 24 to 36 hours to get the spirits the first time, but then it only takes a couple of minutes to call them back again usually, and it just kept taking forever. Finally, the shaman jumped up and he said, take your son home, take him home, I can't do anything for him. And they thought, oh, he's just trying to get more money out of us. And he says, the father said, I'm sorry. The only pig we had was a baby pig. We'll find a bigger pig and bring him back to you, but please, won't you heal my son? And the shaman said, no, that's not the problem. You see, I was calling and calling and calling for the spirits to come, and they weren't coming. And so I started thinking, what's going on here? And I looked into the spirit world and started looking around, and I saw all of the spirits were lined up all around the house. Outside of the house, they couldn't come in. And so I started looking around inside the house, trying to figure out what was going on, and I looked over to where your son was laying. And when I saw him, I saw that there was a huge, brilliant white angel, or spirit, he didn't know he was an angel, a spirit, standing guard over your son. And my spirits couldn't come in as long as he was standing guard over your son. So take him home. There's nothing I can do for him. So they loaded their son back in the hammock and started off back down the trail back to their hut again. And the father started thinking, this is the most powerful shaman in the whole region. And whoever this spirit is that has been guarding my son, now that he's chosen this new God, he must be more powerful than the spirits that we're dealing with. And so when they got home, he talked to his wife and he said, I think maybe we need to let our son worship this God that he's found. And she said, yeah, I think so too. I agree. Within minutes, their son woke up from the coma. By evening, he was completely well again. The next morning, he went back to his mountain farm, started working again for his father in their mountain farm. And through his witness, there is now a church in the region of Sibakli. So, at this point, we had 2 generations of churches. Was our work finished? No, not yet finished? Okay. So, one more story. As I said, after college, I came back to the Philippines. This time, though, I was not to be the lead missionary. My job now was to train and empower, help them to go beyond what they had reached at this point. So like you saw in the last story, we had 2nd-generation churches, but they were mostly still within their own tribe. They weren't really growing beyond that. And so when I came back, a whole lot of stories there, I won't go into. I'll skip to one particular one, though. There was a young man in the village where I based with the Taubweed tribe. His name was Manuel, and Manuel was just a sponge. He loved learning. And he when he found out that I was there and that I knew some things he didn't know, he would come and he would talk to me and ask me questions until 12 o'clock, 1 a.m., in the middle of the night, just as long as I could manage, and just night after night after night, just soaking it up. And during our conversations, he was convicted that he needed to be a missionary too, to his people. And Manuel became an incredible missionary, went far beyond anything that I could ever do. He went to a region that was completely untouched. Actually, there were some prophetic dreams and visions that showed that this area was the most dark and closed and demonically controlled area that desperately needed the gospel. And in about 2.5 years, this man planted 13 churches, 3 generations of churches. So the 2 mother churches that he started with, he trained them to plant daughter churches, and then trained those leaders to train their churches to plant more churches, etc., and keep on going like that. And one of the places that he and his team went, a second generation church, is up here in this village. And after they had planted the church, after they had led people to Christ, they started training them, of course. And when it came time for Manuel and his team to move on, they left one of the young men there, whose name was Aton, to be the church elder. Now, this man only had a few months' worth of training and Bible experience. Manuel would come back and visit him again, but for the next several months, he was on his own, and he didn't really feel up to the task. He was really, really nervous about this, being the leader of this new church. But Manuel, before he left, put his hand on his shoulder and said, "Aton, remember, whatever happens, pray to God about it. Talk to God about it. He'll help you." And then he left. Well, Aton had just been married a few months when Manuel left, and a few months later, his wife went into labor with their very first son. And so Aton was, of course, super excited and super worried at the same time, and there's a village midwife that was helping his wife, and so he's bustling around trying to do something, keep busy, trying to help, and finally, about 24 hours later, his wife gave birth, and he's super excited again. Finally, his wife has given birth, and he found out that it was a son. He was outside, clearing things up, and until he heard his wife cry out and say, "He's dead, he's dead, he's dead." And Aton ran back up into the house, saw his son laying there lifeless on the bamboo floor, put his hand out, touched him, and he told me, he actually wrote this story to me in a letter. He told me, he said that his son was as cold as the rocks in the river that ran by their village. And he was so sad. He and his wife both stumbled out into the dirt outside of their house, and it was night by this time, and just sat there in the dirt for hour after hour. The whole village came, and as their custom is, like I said, they do everything together. And each person, about 100 people in that village, each one of them went up into the house, checked on the baby, made sure he was really dead, and then came out and just stayed there with Aton and his wife until about 4 hours later, the sun was starting to come up, starting to be false dawn, and one of the village elders came up to Aton, put his hand on his shoulder and said, "Brother, it's time. In our customs, before the sun comes up, we have to bury him." And it kind of woke Aton up, kind of shocked him and woke him up, and he remembered what Manuel had told him about whatever happens, remember to pray to God about it. And so right there in the dirt in front of the whole village, Aton started praying and just poured his heart out, begging for God's help, begging that God would bring his baby back to life again. When he had said everything that he could say, he climbed back up the ladder into his hut, walked over to his child who was still laying there not breathing, but he put his hand out and touched his son, and to his surprise, his son was normal body temperature again. And so he grabbed up his son. He's still not breathing, right? He grabbed up his son, and he's walking back and forth. He can't think of, what do I do? What do I do? He's not breathing. I know he's alive again. God answered my prayer, but and he remembered that the midwives would sometimes slap the babies to get him breathing again. And so he gave his baby a good whack on the back, and that baby let out the loudest ear-piercing scream that he said was the most beautiful thing that he had ever heard. His baby was alive again. God had answered his prayer in front of the whole village. And there are times when God works miracles, and it does lead to people accepting Christ, especially in places where they live with the demons all day, live in fear and terror of the demons night and day. Seeing God work this openly and this powerfully was the key to really the planting of the church in that village. And now that church, the village of Holbrook, the Holbrook church, is now planting the next generation of churches in their areas and training leaders just like Aton to cry out to God and to lead people to faith and to train them, to disciple them, just like he had been discipled. The churches that my family and I planted, basically my parents planted 3 churches, and then I worked with another one when I came back. Those churches and the leaders that we trained in those churches now have gone on to plant 47 more churches in 4 different tribes with more than 2,700 baptized believers. They've even sent their own foreign missionaries now to other parts of the Philippines where there are other tribes that don't know anything about Jesus and no one to tell them. This is the power of multiplying discipleship, the way that Jesus and Paul and the apostles demonstrated how to reach the world. We call this, I think I mentioned this earlier, we call this in missiology a disciple-making movement, or sometimes a church-planting movement. Mrs. White says, she doesn't use that term, it's a modern term, but she says in so many words that there were 2 times in history where there have been global disciple-making movements. The first was right after Jesus went back to heaven, and we know that almost the entire world was reached. The 12 apostles and Paul went all the way from the east coast of China to Britain in the west and down to southern India. Really, the Americas were all that was left. Similarly, in the early Adventist movement, get that out right, there was another global disciple-making movement. But Mrs. White says each of those times, God left a few people still to reach, to test the next generation, to see if they would be faithful to the mission strategies, to discipleship, the way that he had taught us to reach people. And each time, we got distracted. We got distracted by theological debates. We got distracted by building churches. We got distracted by trusting professionals to do the work that God had given to the entire church, the work that God had organized his church to do, the work of making disciples. But Mrs. White says there will be one more final global disciple-making movement. And this time, God won't allow it to stop, and he will push it forward until the whole world is reached. And so I want to challenge you. I want to challenge the Chatsworth Church. I want to beg you, the Chatsworth Church, and to charge you with the same charge that Christ gave his church, to make disciples. Make disciples here in Murray County. Go out to the lost. Spend time with lost people. Help lost people. And as you're doing so, open the Bible. Read the Bible with them. Discuss the Bible with them, just like we do. You don't have to memorize, a long list of beliefs. You don't have to know, the history of all the background, all the culture of the Hebrews. All you need to do is be with people, spend time with people, make friends, and read the Bible with them, study the Bible with them, and train them to go and do the same thing with other people. Who will you disciple this year until we meet again next year?